All right, it's a tight little group here, so that's great. And it's kind of really nice to be invited to share with this group in particular. My wife and I. My wife is Rachel Whipple. Um, we've been associated with LDS Earth Stewardship from its sort of infancy days. A little bit less now, just because of other responsibilities. But it's great to see all the good work that's been going on and the advancement that's happening. So, yeah. So thanks for this chance to talk. So I want to start with this picture right here. This is our oldest child at the top of Slate Canyon. Slate Canyon is sort of my little happy place. It's a canyon here close to where I live. And it's a very steep hike up to this meadow, which is an old sheep grazing meadow. There's a little spring up there, keeps it kind of green like that all year long. Anyway, so I'd hiked up here with my kid, and it's not an easy hike. It's steep, like I said, and so there was lots of complaining and lots of encouraging to make it to the top. But when I got to the top and I took a rest, this is what I saw, and it made me happy. So I snapped a little picture. And what made me happy about this was, well, I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm convinced that, and I have no sort of objective evidence for this other than my gut feeling and experiences like are represented in this picture, that in proportion to the amount of time we intentionally spend in the presence of and looking closely at plants, all the world's problems will be solved. So I'm just putting all my cards out there on the table. That's my conviction. And the rest of it is just a footnote, I guess, to that. That's what I believe. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a little project that's been going on here in my neighborhood that we started last year, almost kind of as a COVID project. But I want to go back to the beginning of sort of plants and gardens in my life. And this is the beginning for me. So 1976, Spencer Kimball gives I'm sorry about the street noise, I'm in my back here, but Spencer Kimball gives a talk in general conference in which he encourages everybody to plant the garden. And so I was born in 1975, so I was 1 year old when this happened. But my family took this to heart, and we promptly planted a garden. And this is where I grew up. I grew up in Warren, Oregon. So this is our backyard, and it's kind of creepy because I didn't take this picture. I got this picture off of Zillow. So if you want to stalk your old childhood home, Zillow's a good way to do it. I could even see pictures of how they remodeled my bedroom, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. Okay, anyway, that's an aside. So here, this is my childhood home. We had 2 acres, I think, and they put in a really big garden, and we would all participate in putting in the garden, getting it planted. But then the kids were basically responsible for doing all of the weeding. So my mom would wake me up and say, go weed the beans. And so I felt like I was the one who actually did all the taking care of it, which I didn't particularly like. But as I said, all the world's problems will be solved in proportion to the amount of time we spend in the company of and looking closely at plants. So what did I learn in that gardening experiment, in that gardening experience? And this is what I learned, that seeds are miracles. So we would put these little nuggets, these little hard shells, into the dirt, and then you add water and some sun and some time, and then a plant grows, which to my sort of 6, 7, 8-year-old mind was a miracle. And I never really understood exactly how that could be possible, and I was fascinated by it. So forward to my college years, I started off as a pre-med student, and I luckily quickly realized that really wasn't for me, and thought back to what am I actually interested in. And I remembered this experience of watching seeds grow, and I was like, I want to know how that happens. So I changed my major to botany, and from that point on, my whole professional life and much of my personal life has really been devoted to understanding plant growth and plant development. And it's pretty fascinating. So I've learned a lot about what it is that makes a seed go from a seed to a plant. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about it now because I can't help but share the love of botany just a little bit. But at the end, even after all I could learn about plant growth and development, it's still a miracle. So what are seeds? If you look at seed ontogeny, ontogeny is just a fancy word for the growth and development, from beginning to end of this organ. If you look at where they originate inside, deep inside the recesses of a flower. So here's a flower that's been chopped in half, and you can see kind of the outer petals. And then internal to that, you can see the stamens. Those are the male reproductive organs. And then right in the middle is the pistil. That's the female reproductive organ. So at the top of the pistil, maybe you can see my little arrow here. That's the stigma, and that's where pollen lands. And this is the style. And then down here's the ovary. So pollen will land on that stigma, pollen from either this stamen or another flower that's been transported likely by an insect vector. And then the pollen will grow a tube down through this style, come out on the receptacle here, and then grow out into this little sac here. This little sac is called an ovule. And that pollen will then deliver 2 sperm cells. So the pollen tube is carrying with it 2 tiny sperm cells that it will deliver to that little sac. So if we zoom in on that little sac, this is what it looks like. This little sac right here is called an ovule. It's on a stalk called a funiculus, and it's got a little sort of coating on the outside, which are called the integuments, and a little tiny pore right here. And you can actually see on this image the pollen tube growing on the funiculus and growing into that little pore. And once it reaches that pore, it sort of bursts open, releases its sperm, 2 sperms. 1 sperm fertilizes an egg, and the other sperm fertilizes this central cell. And it actually fertilizes 2 nuclei in that central cell. So if you remember back to your sort of animal biology, which is how most of us learned about sexual reproduction, we learned that a sperm cell unites with an egg, and that makes a zygote or a diploid organism. Well, in plants, you get 2 fertilization events. You get 1 fertilization that will create the embryo, and that will have 1 genome from the father and 1 from the mother, and then another fertilization which creates what's called the endosperm. And that will actually have 3 copies, 2 from the mother and 1 from the father. And so anyway, after that fertilization event, the embryo will grow and the endosperm will grow. And the endosperm you can almost think of as sort of like a placenta, but not exactly. It's a storage organ that stores nutrients for the growing embryo. And then this outer part right here, these integuments, they will form the coating of the seed. So after fertilization, this ovule transforms itself. It grows and grows. And if it was a bean plant, it'll grow into something like this. So this is what, if you pop open a bean plant, you'll see there's 2 halves to it. Those 2 halves are what are called the cotyledons. So those 2 cotyledons are actually the leaves of the seed, and they've been modified to contain fats and proteins that are storage for the young growing embryo when it finally grows. And so internal to that, connected to those 2 cotyledons, is the little baby embryo. And all it is a couple of little leaves and then a little root. And that's all that embryo is, right? So if you think of a human embryo has all of the parts of an adult. It has all the organs, right? It has a head, it has feet, it has all the toes, all the internal organs. This is not a complete plant. This is just 2 little baby leaves and 1 little baby embryonic root. But that little thing right there can be completely desiccated and last for years and years. But if you add it to soil, it will grow, right? And it will turn into a bean plant. And like I said, there's a lot more than what I just shared with you. I wanted to share some specifics because I can't help myself as an instructor of botany. But the more you know about this, the more, at least it becomes clear to me, that the growth of this really is a miracle. And one of the miracles, or one of the ways of describing this miracle, is a Greek word called autopoiesis. So that's a fancy word, but I can break it down really simple for you. Auto means self, and poiesis means creation or production. And this is the miracle to me of seeds. They make themselves. Nobody makes them, right? They make themselves. And the plant grows and makes itself. It creates itself. But that's not quite fair, right? It needs the environment, and it needs a cultivator in the case of a bean plant, or, it's not self-sufficient, but yet it's not designed and created by an external agent either. And I think that's a really powerful metaphor. Once you understand that seeds are self-generating, self-creating units, I think that gives you a broader insight into how we use this metaphor of the seed in the gospel. So Jesus, of course, compared the kingdom of heaven to a grain of mustard seed. So a man takes this seed, he sows it in his field, and even though this seed is smaller than all, it will grow into a large herb like a tree, so that the birds of the air will come and lodge in its branches, right? And I think that's a really beautiful, powerful metaphor, because just like seeds, which grow of their own, they make themselves, but with our help and cultivation, that is a beautiful metaphor for the kingdom of heaven. It will grow and create itself, right? It needs our help, but we don't make it. It makes itself in our presence before our eyes as a miracle. Okay, so that as an introduction to seeds and how I got started and how I got fascinated by plants. I want to go back to 3 questions from Sharon Eubank's fall forum in 2020 that she asked us to consider. And I think they're really good questions, and they're a good way to organize what I want to talk about today. So the first question she asked us to consider was, when we waste what others desperately need, what physically happens to unity and our hearts? So that's a question about waste and what it does to us spiritually. Oops. The second question, well, looks like I got all 3 questions now, but the second question, why do we feel God in his creations? And what do others feel in our creations? And then the third question is, what would move our hearts to swell wide as eternity? Okay, 3 good questions that will help. The first question is about waste, right? And what waste does to us spiritually. So gardens are great because they help us avoid waste. This is a study from 2005. You can see the citation down there. Turns out that if you tally up the amount of land area devoted to yards and turf grass, there's 40 million acres of it. And the black regions of this map show you where that is. It is actually America's #1 crop. We grow more turf grass than we do corn. And corn at least does something, right? We feed it to our cows and our pigs, and then we eat the milk or the beef or the chickens that get fed the corn. Grass, as far as I can tell, does almost nothing. It does, there's some aesthetic something to it, but for the amount of land that's dedicated to it, there's some significant waste. And we're addicted to yards, certainly in the United States. This is my local ward, the Provo First Ward, and most of that block where this church house is located is actually, well, a good chunk of it's actually parking lot, and then the rest of it is turf grass. And that seems to me like a little bit of a waste. And then I was called a couple of years ago, my wife and I were called to be to be the emergency preparedness specialist for the ward. And that's not necessarily something that is high on my list of interests. There's other people that are really into that kind of thing, and I'm not necessarily into that. But as I was thinking of how I could make this something that I was passionate about and how I could make this calling align with my own values, I started thinking about gardens and this notion of waste and how we have around us so much land that could be more productively used. And in our culture, we have this tradition of growing gardens. And maybe I could help somehow with my own interests and my own passions to do that. So I approached the bishop with that. I was like, can we be expansive with how we interpret what it means to be an emergency preparedness specialist? Because I looked up the description and it didn't have anything about growing community gardens anywhere in there. And in my mind, I was like, well, maybe we could dig up some of the front lawn here and plant a garden. I knew that wasn't likely to happen, but I was just presenting this notion to the bishop, and he's like, you know what? I think we can do something like that. And he reminded me of this man right here. So this man is John Baird. John Baird is my neighbor. He was a bishop in our ward several years previously. Just a delightful human being. Has a large backyard that just because of life circumstances, he's not able to care for like he used to, but there was at one time a large garden in his backyard. His wife had just recently passed away, and he's a widower, and physically he can't turn that back into a garden, but the bishop said, I think if you talk to John, he might be open to the idea of turning his backyard into a garden. I was like, wow, that sounds like a great idea. So I contacted him, and he was more than gracious. He showed me his backyard, and he said, just do whatever you want. And so we did. We just got going. And I don't have a picture of what it looked like before. I wish I did. And I'll show you some picture of the transformation that it became. But let's just say it was a derelict backyard a little bit. It was just a place to store all the stuff of a life, like a lot of our yards are, right? They just accumulate and accumulate. All right, so to end this first part, don't waste. Some thoughts on this, don't waste. One is consider your callings, and consider them from the perspective of your own commitments to earth stewardship. And don't waste your callings, right? And I feel like I was kind of maybe a little bit inspired to rethink what this calling could potentially be, and think of ways that it could align with my own values. So the next is be bold and proactive to propose new solutions that align with your values. If you have a specific skill set, for me, it's, I'm passionate and nerdy about plants. How can I use that, right, in a way that blesses others? Whatever your skill set is, don't waste it, and use it to expand others. And then the third thought I wanted to bring back is work with your leaders. Identify needs that you aren't aware of, because your leaders are going to know things going on in your local area that you don't. And together, it's going to be something maybe better, because I would have just dug up the front yard of the church, right? Maybe not the best approach. The bishop had a better idea of how to take my passion and direct it someplace a little more fruitful. Okay, so that was the first question. The second question Sharon Rebrink brings to us: what? I wrote that wrong. What do we feel in God's creations? Or no, I wrote it right. Why do we feel God in his creations? Yes. And what do others feel in our creations? So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the garden and how and the story of it. So this is the earliest picture I have, so May of last year, and you can see we've already made quite a bit of progress. You can see back here kind of a mostly chopped down tree. That was a gigantic pile of branches in his backyard. So the first thing we did is we rented a chipper shredder, and we shredded that gigantic tree into a pile of wood chips. And then that wood chips became our mulch. And then we tilled his backyard. Well, we got rid of all of the garbage that we could, tilled his backyard, formed these little hillocks, and put the mulch in between the rows. And then we set up a a little drip line on each of the rows. And I use the fact that I have access as a BYU professor to a greenhouse to grow a whole bunch of starts, lettuce, kale, chard, etc. Right, so I kind of did most of this on my own. But once we got started and people could see what we were doing, they just spontaneously started chipping in. People would stop by and load up trash and haul it off to the dump. Others that garden would donate their own starts. And it just sort of organically, if you will, grew. And I think it was helpful that this was the beginnings of COVID-19 and people were feeling a need to garden. This was a worldwide phenomenon, I believe. So not just me, many people were. And so this garden became not my creation, but a co-creation, right? I had an idea of what it was going to be, but it became something better than that in the end with the input and the help of everyone else. We deliberately set it up as what I'm calling a communal garden rather than a community garden. So you may have heard of community garden projects in your particular area. And they're probably the most common model for how to do this. So a community garden, you have multiple individual plots, or sometimes they divide them up into a little raised bed. And then the responsibility distributed to particular users of that. So if you get a share or a plot, then that's yours. You take care of it. They'll give you maybe some water or some other shared goods, but it's your job to do it. And that has a lot of good to it because it maximizes your individual freedom to do with that little piece what you will, and you therefore have a strong buy-in with that piece of land. But I've also noticed that this also has what's called the tragedy of the commons. So often people will get really excited about their spot, but then they won't necessarily fully commit to it. And then maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of those plots will just be left abandoned, right? And so what could be this beautiful, amazing garden with everybody doing their little piece is a couple of gardens where people are doing their piece really nice, and the rest of it is just a patch of weeds. So I didn't want that to happen to John's amazing backyard. So I decided to take this communal garden approach, which is a little bit more centralized. So here we have a single shared garden plot, a single organizer, which in this case was more or less me, that manages most of the operations. And the centralized care means reduced. So the trade-off there is that with the centralized care, you have maybe a reduced buy-in and commitment from the users, but I think the overall aesthetics are better. And I think for our situation in this particular location, that was the right model to follow. And for selfish reasons, it was the right model to follow as well, because I was the most maybe passionate, at least right now, about this project. And so I could have people come and help when they had time. And I will send out an email, and I have a list of people that are interested. And I'll send out an email maybe once a week telling them, hey, this is the update and this is what we're doing and this is the help we need. And people will show up on a Saturday or a Tuesday to come help out. And not everybody shows up, but if 5 people show up, that's pretty much all the help we need. And that allows me to have a really gigantic space that gets gardened well with all the helpers. And the helpers then feel like they've put in enough work that they can come and take whatever they want, because this is really not my garden. This is everyone's garden. And but that gives everyone else the flexibility, I guess, that they need. And since we have a lot of students in our area, BYU students, we're a student ward, it gives them a chance to engage in a low stakes sort of way, right? They don't have to, they can only put in the time that they feel like they have and then learn along the way. Right, and so just here's some pictures trying to show that, yeah, we got lots of young families that maybe don't have gardens or a chance to garden, but they can come and just contribute a little bit. It gives us a chance to try out new techniques. So on the right, you can see these poles, sort of, these are T-posts, and we put some aluminum poles between those T-posts, and that allows us to stake up our tomatoes and our beans and our squashes and turn this into a more of a vertical garden, and we get a lot more productivity that way. And there's other little tricks and techniques like this that we can just explore and learn together with, right? And some of them don't work and some of them work great. So it's a bit of a lab as well, where we try different things out. And here you can see like how we can grow squash vertically. So these are pumpkins kind of growing up those vines so that you have more space to grow more things because you're using your up and down as well as just the flat surface. This was the quote unquote garden shed that was at the property before I arrived. And this is more or less what it looked like. It basically had no more roof. And this was sort of cheap plywood that was melting in the weather. And this was not a priority of mine to do, but someone else in the neighborhood who got interested looked at that and was like, we can do better. And this is Mark, he's one of my neighbors that decided this. And so he made it his project to fix up this little garden shed. And again, this is just a great example of how this was a co-creation. This was not my idea, this was his idea. And he organized it. He had the know-how, how to replace the roof and kind of get this sealed back up and weatherized. And you can see that here's the progress of that. So this was, like I said, this was not one of the goals of mine for last summer, but because it was a communal co-creation, we were able to create this sort of cute little garden shed, which adds significantly to the aesthetics of the place and makes for a great place to store our garden tools. Okay, so that's the end of sort of part number 2, right? Which is, what do others feel in our creations, and what do we feel in God's creations? Okay, so now I want to move to part number 3, which is Sharon's question: what would move our hearts to swell wide as eternity? And this part will maybe be kind of short. So because this was a communal garden, it wasn't just for our LDS community, it was for the whole neighborhood. And so we had several parties along the way. I think this was our tomato party, where we harvested tomato and someone baked bread, and people just brought food, and we harvested all the tomatoes we could and made tomato sandwiches and tomato salads and ate tomatoes and talked. Appropriately distanced and masked up as best we could. And this was delightful. And I think we need more spaces like this. We're in this age of extreme political polarization, and we need to engage in the kind of activities where that's not how we identify. We can identify as something else. And the common ground, which is the earth, and the fact that we all like food and we all like being in nature, is a way that we can avoid those polarizing topics and share something that's meaningful for all of us. And what that does is and I found this myself because I was out there gardening and chatting with people that I know don't share my political views at all, but I could stop seeing them as the political enemy, which of course none of them are, but it's easy to fall into that kind of way of thinking. But when you share this common ground, you can see them as people that share the same values as you do, and it's easy for your heart to swell wide open to include those people as well. All right, this is going to be maybe a short little presentation. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but so just want to kind of wrap up the presentation here and think a little bit about communal gardens and what are maybe the traditional benefits that are thought of for why you might want to have a home garden or a community garden. So one thought is, you're going to get healthier food. You're going to get tastier food. You're going to be thrifty economically. You're going to save money. Or it's going to be better for the environment than industrial agricultural food would be. Right? Your food's going to be local. You're not going to have pesticides, etc. And all of those may be true, but actually maybe not. I think I'm enough of an academic to know that if you look deeply into any of these claims about gardening, it may not hold up. The food that you grow, that the average home gardener grows, may actually cost more than what you could pay at a grocery store to grow that exact same amount of food. And it may be actually no healthier than the food you could get from a grocery store. So I don't know that this is actually the benefit of a garden. But if that's what gets you going, that's all that matters. So if you have any interest, whether it be for these reasons or something else, the point is to garden. Because to come back to my original point, the point of the garden is not the fruits that you produce. It's the connection with the earth. And if you have a community sort of garden, it's the connection with the others that you produce, that you generate along the way. That's the point of the garden. And the tasty tomatoes and the tasty corn, etc., that we produced are just side benefits. It's the creation of community that really matters. And so that is the end of my presentation, and at least formally what I wanted to present. But I'd love to just sort of chat for a bit if people have questions or just want to share their own thoughts of similar things that they've done.